I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. It isn't often that we do an episode on national politics, but my UMBC colleague, political scientist Tom Schaller, and his co-author, the Washington-based columnist Paul Waldman, just published a new book called White Rural Rage that is now a New York Times bestseller. Schaller and Waldman join me to discuss their book on the threat to American democracy. Music for this episode comes from Damascus, Maryland-based rapper and music producer Cataclysm, who, as Matt Thornton, used to be my student at UMBC. Songs used in this episode come from his album Machine Gun Preacher. You can find his music on YouTube at The Reckoning 301.
And when you feel like there's no feeling, when you walk, it's with yourself. But when you search for understanding,
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning, precisely when we don't agree with each other. Like now.
Laugh and then we ponder for a bit. On a cloud we flying higher than where Beanstalk brothers live. Holla feed fire to the faux phone cannons look just like some handguns. And your man done when that ransom look too handsome. We can't stand son. Come walk with bosses in the peaceful backyard garden. Just had to talk with Harden and the money be the problem. Surrounded by the goblins, the vultures, the rats. Impacted by the culture. I perform with my back to my enemies. And I fricassee their carcass. I pass the bone to matches and dispatch some gas to start.
Tom Schaller, Paul Waldman, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Congratulations on your new book, White Rural Rage. Define for me what the white rural population is. What is the size? What is the scope of this?
There are different definitions depending on whether you're looking at codes or county codes, or whether you're looking at population density, proximity to cities. So there's no one uniform definition. Even the U.S. government, the USDA, has different definitions than other departments. But as a back of the envelope, the generally agreed upon share is approximately 20% of the country lives in rural America. Of that, one quarter, 24%, are non-white. So let's just say a quarter, which is 5%. That means the remaining 15% are the subject of our book. And even that is an inspecific measure. And why is that, Sunil? Because what really makes somebody rural, to borrow the old phrase, you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy, is rural consciousness. And so there are some people who are born and bred, graduate high school, they're top of their class, they get into some Ivy League school or some liberal arts school, or they just get into the big state university and they go off to Raleigh or Madison and they don't move back, and they become doctors and lawyers and engineers, but they still maintain their rural consciousness even if they're living in Milwaukee, and vice versa. There are people who have spent their entire lives growing up on the west side of Manhattan, and then they move to rural Putnam County in my home state of New York, and they're living in farmland, but they certainly don't have rural consciousness because they moved there when they were 65. Even if you categorize people based on where they file their taxes and collect their mail, it's an inspecific measure because of mobility.
So why are they, in your view, a distinct analytical category?
Well, I think that it's because more than anything, the starting point is the kind of disproportionate power that has been given to rural areas and the people who live there, especially the areas that are majority white. And this is something that is built into certain features of the American political system that people probably are very familiar with, that every state gets 2 senators. So rural states like, say, Wyoming, that has 600,000 people, get the same representation in the United States Senate as the 39 million people who live in California. And you have the Electoral College that then kind of leverages the Senate into into the presidential race. You also have a situation in the House of Representatives, and I think most people don't really realize this, that rural areas are dramatically overrepresented in the House of Representatives. We can get into details about that. And then within states, Republicans often draw district lines and change other rules to make sure that the rural areas wield disproportionate power. And also the way they are kind of elevated in the culture and given a special sort of status, which is something I'm sure we'll talk about. And then that combines to give them unusual influence over our politics in ways that we say that we all have to understand and confront.
American politics is also highly coalitional. Institutions alone don't determine outcomes. So can you explain how the white rural population fits into a coalition that then translates into significant numbers and power that you're seeing?
They are in coalition, obviously, in the broadest sense with the conservative movement and the Republican Party, and in the contemporary parlance with the MAGA movement. And so at the margins, that 15%, especially if it's coalesced around one party or one movement or set of ideas or politicians, it can certainly be a tipping point coalition and pivotal. The weirdest finding as we went through the research on this is that they may even be more strategically advantaged in the House. There are more purely rural or rural suburban influence districts, according to Bloomberg City Lab project, which classified all 435 House districts into 6 categories. 42% of them are rural leaning suburban or purely rural. Only 19% are purely urban or urban suburban. It's 2-to-1, even though there's more people who live in cities than in rural America. Rural Americans have twice as much districts that they have influence over in the Congress. It's insane. And so rural Americans, yeah, they're only 15% white Americans. And are they shrinking? Yeah, we haven't been a majority rural country since the 1920 census. From a strictly numerical standpoint, white people are shrinking as a share of the population, and white rural people are shrinking even faster. 53% of counties between 2010 and 2020 lost population in America. We're pretty sure that is the first time in American history that a majority of counties were smaller at the end of the decade than they were at the start of that decade. But 67% of rural counties lost population. 2 in 3 rural counties in 2020 was smaller than it was in 2010. And I think, frankly, this leads into and fuels senses of the great replacement theory and the kind of triggering language that we're hearing from the Tucker Carlsons of the world saying they're trying to replace you. They're trying to bring in immigrants and their population birth rates, and you should not be pro-choice. You should make as many white babies, and this kind of stuff, like, this racialized stuff about America needs to be white. I mean, and that's frankly white nationalist talk.
Are you conflating small town and rural population? To you, is that the same analytical category, or is there a difference between?
The largest geographic county east of the Mississippi is St. Louis County in Minnesota, and it's a pretty still Democratic county. It's one of the few counties that hung on and didn't go from Obama to Trump. And it's about 200,000 people in that county. It's a very long county that borders Canada at the top. But most of the population lives in and around the Duluth metropolitan area, which is the anchor city. About 100,000 people live in Duluth metropolitan area broadly, and about 100,000 people live in the rest of the county. So it's kind of a half rural county and a half urban small city. Now, Duluth is not Minneapolis, of course. And I point this out for a reason. Rurality is partly about population density. But it's also, as we talk about in the book, it's about proximity. So you could have 2 rural communities that have the same population per square mile, and one of them's 17 miles north of Duluth, headed toward the Canadian border, and one of them's 51 miles, 3 times that distance. If you looked at just population density, you'd say, well, those are 2 rural communities in terms of how rural they are. But they're not, because one county is a bedroom county to Duluth, and people may work, they may recreate, they may have neighbors and friends. Their economies are more connected to Duluth if they're 17 miles away. But if you're 51 miles away, you're fundamentally different. And as we talk about in a part of chapter 2, that proximity is prosperity, we know that rural areas that have at least a small rural airport that are within a certain driving distance of a metropolitan area, they tend to thrive a little bit more just because of the natural geography of economy. They have more interface.
Do you see also, as a consequence of all that, what you just explained, Tom, a variation in the rage?
I don't know if there's a variation in the rage. That's probably driven more by culture. But what we do know is from my colleagues, Dante Scala and Richard Johnson, that the economies and how they're based, particularly economies that are more recreational, tend to be a little bit more blue. And so they're probably a little less conservative and maybe a little less angry. I don't know if you can track anger to partisanship or ideology. Communities that are more based in extractive economies and farming, which sort of have to be set apart from cities, generally speaking, tend to be a little bit more conservative. So I don't want to layer place and population density directly on anger, because I think that's a dangerous analogy to make. But all else equal, there are differences in rural areas in terms of the nature of their economy and their proximity to cities. So we spent some time in the Adirondacks, right? And so Lake Placid, everybody knows, is the home of, the Miracle on Ice in February of 1980. And there's a lot of people who are living up there who aren't from there. They're not from the North Country. They're not from the Adirondack. They're up there because I went to college with some of these guys. They're ski bums, and they moved there because they wanted to ski on Whiteface Mountain and bike and hike in the summers. And their politics are fundamentally different from the people who grew up in Lake Placid or Clear Lake or Saranac Lake or Harrietstown or Wilmington. And so it's more about interface and interconnectivity, I think, and distance to city, which tends to influence people's, interpersonal relationships, their cultural experiences, and their economic relationships in a way that's going to influence their politics. But it's a pretty complex formula.
What are the cultural manifestations of this power? Where are we seeing it most?
And when you talk to rural people, they will often say that they feel either ignored by the culture, or that they are denigrated, that they are portrayed as ignorant and poor and anti-intellectual, and that they're just a bunch of hillbillies. There's also, however, another strain of representations of rural America that's become increasingly common, that portrays them as kind of the truest Americans, the people who are honest and capable and competent. And so you see a kind of a regular storyline of some city slicker who finds his way to the country, and it turns out that everyone there has a lot more common sense than he does, and he can't do anything. He can barely tie his own shoes, and they know how to fix cars and solve problems. And he learns that they are, in fact, just as smarter than he is. You also have, for instance, in country music, which I think may be the best-selling music genre in America, there's a huge amount of like a couple of entire subgenres that are all about portraying rural life as something that is enjoyable and rich and kind of the thing that is infused with values. On the one hand, there's a lot of sort of very sentimental songs about rural life that are all about how, this is what life should be like. And there's also what's often called bro country, that is all about pickup trucks and dirt roads and parties down by the river. That's all about how this is the most fun life that you can lead. And so you have all that going on. And then you have political culture, where small towns and rural areas are absolutely venerated. You often hear candidates talking about how we need small town values in Washington, and that this is where the real Americans live. You never hear a candidate saying we need big city values in Washington. Now, you could make that case. I've tried to do it in columns a couple of times, that actually what you learn in a big city is extremely valuable, and maybe more valuable than what you learn in a small town when it comes to knowing how to govern. But nobody ever says that. The assumption is that the small towns are where the realest real Americans live, and that's where people are honest and true. On the one hand, they have extra political power, given this kind of elevated cultural status. And on the other hand, they feel as though, with some justification, that their communities are being left behind by economic changes, and they have all kinds of struggles that are not being addressed properly by the political system. And that then, I think, feeds into the feelings of resentment. One of the researchers that we spoke to, a historian, called it kind of a golden era in the coal fields in Appalachia, that existed basically from like the New Deal to the 60s or so, when the New Deal reforms managed to create some protections for workers, and the United Mine Workers Union was strong, and people were making better pay and getting good benefits. And you could, with only a high school education or even without a high school education, go to work in the coal mines and make a middle class living and be able to support your family. And then that began to disappear. And what happened was, as the kind of war on labor unions matured, and the union got less strong, and you had all these technological changes that meant fewer and fewer jobs working in coal, that those jobs began to disappear. And what the coal companies that were making huge profits, sucking all of the prosperity from these areas, using people's labor for their own profit, what they did was they realized that they needed to change people's perspective on this. And they needed to convince people that the line of conflict was not between workers and companies. It was between everybody in coal country, including the coal companies and outsiders. And so they created a thing called Friends of Coal, which was this comprehensive years-long PR effort funded by the coal companies to convince people of this, to tell them that your problem is not that we are sucking your communities dry. Your problem is environmentalists. Your problem is people from outside Appalachia who want to take your living away. And when you see those jobs disappear, blame the environmentalists, blame liberals, blame people in cities. Don't blame the coal companies who are still making money hand over fist, even as they are not providing you with the living that you were promised.
You know, I thought that the central point of the book was that the white rural population are powerful and yet impotent, and thus the rage.
Their understanding of the political mechanism as being broken is not wrong. You can't go down in Congress if you got every Democrat in the U.S. House of Representatives and every Republican in the same chamber and all the Democrats and the Republicans in the Senate and whoever's in the White House to pass a bill to say we're going to halt globalization. You can't do that, right? You can put tariffs on if you want, but they backfire. I just got done talking to a rural farmer from Shelby County, Ohio, who, turned on Trump because those retaliatory Chinese tariffs are destroying his profits in his dairy farm. And we had record numbers of dairy farmers committing suicide during the Trump era. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about the $23 billion buyout. And the fascinating thing about this, Sunil, is that Donald Trump went to coal country in 2016 and said, get ready to start working your asses off. There were 52,000 coal jobs when he said that. By the end of his term, there were 38,000. 1 out of 4 had lost. More people work at, what is it, Paul?
Panda Express.
Panda Express than work in the coal industry today. And so 1/4 of the jobs lost. Was it Trump's fault? No. Trump couldn't put a giant sign up saying halt technological change. The jobs were leaving before Trump took office, and they were leaving while he took office, and they're probably, having double checked, have still continued to decline because technology has replaced the coal worker. So the difference is that he made a false promise. And the fascinating thing is we found a poll that showed when rural Americans are asked, should we try to revive old economy jobs? Should we try to bring back coal and farming? Or should we look to new economy jobs in healthcare and education? By a 2-to-1 margin, 60-30, they said, bring us new economy jobs. They agreed with what Hillary Clinton said when she went to coal country and said, look, these jobs aren't going to come back, but we're going to retrain you. We're going to put money into community colleges. We're going to teach you how to code. We're going to teach you how to do records management or new jobs in the information era that maybe you can even do from home and draw a big city salary while still living in a much more lower cost of living rural community, but only if you have broadband, but they don't want to solve the broadband problem. Right? I mean, if you can code, if you're a sharp kid who gets it and was the computer whiz in your middle school, and the teachers are like, oh, Johnny's got it, right? And you can code by the time you're a high school senior, you could go out and get a $125,000 job straight out of high school, skip college, and you could live in a rural community where the housing costs and the other things are half of what they are in the suburbs and cities and draw a city salary because you're working for an employer in Dallas or Austin, right? But we are not moving toward that. And because of rural broadband, I think a lot of rural whites say, you know what? These two parties can't deliver for us, so we might as well vote on their positions on critical race theory and abortion and the border and trans rights, because at least we know the Republican Party is closer to us on that. We don't say that they're voting illogically in a sense, but we do think they should get a better class of Republican.
So we are caught between demagoguery on one hand and false consciousness on the other.
There are so many people who say, Democrats have this problem in rural America, that they have abandoned it. And what they have to do if they want to get any votes in rural America is go there and listen and be respectful and show that they understand the details of people's lives. And only then will they begin to make some inroads to claw back some of what they've lost in rural America. As a political strategy, that's necessary, but not sufficient. The missing piece, nobody ever says anything about what Republicans ought to be offering rural America. We talked to Ben Wickler, who's the chair of the Democratic Party in Wisconsin. And he was telling us that in 2022, for the first time in a long time, they had candidates for state rep in every single district throughout the state. And he said he would have conversations with some of these ones in rural areas, these Democratic candidates, who would call him and say, things are going great here. I don't see my opponent anywhere. They don't have any signs. They don't have it. They're not raising any money. And I'm going out and knocking on doors every day and I'm talking to people and I'm having great conversations. This is going really well. I think I'm going to win. And then on election day, they would get trounced, because the Republican Party didn't have a presence there, but they don't need it. And we were told the same thing when we were in West Virginia. We had a very interesting sit down with a guy named Truman Chafin, who used to be the majority leader of the state Senate. And he was also the chair of the Democratic Party in Mingo County. And he was telling us that the old Democratic machine that Senator Robert Byrd built, that's gone. Nobody even wants the job of Democratic Party chair, which used to be so important to the political and social life of that place. And he said, but you know what? The Republicans don't have an organization here either because they don't need it. They're not going out knocking on doors. They're not trying to mobilize people. They've got all the votes. They don't need to do anything. And Donald Trump won 83% of the vote in that county, Mingo County, in 2016. And then in 2020, he won 85% of the vote.
How are we going to get out of this? I mean, there is one solution. Maryland District 6 is now open. That district goes from Montgomery County all the way to Deep Creek Lake. So it includes Mountain Maryland. That 20% of the population that lives in the mountain, is in the minority versus all the people that live in Montgomery and in Frederick County, which is 80% of Maryland 6. That's a resolution to the problem. But what else is there?
Well, it's fascinating. I don't know if this is still the case, but in the 2010s, as you know, the most gerrymandered set of House maps in the country in a Democrat-controlled state was right here in Maryland, where I teach and you live. And, that pinwheel of death seat, John Sarbanes. And the Democratic Party, under both Glendening and certainly under O'Malley, took a whole chunk of Montgomery voters and put them into the 6th district to get rid of Roscoe Bartlett, right? And I used to write for The Sun, as you know, Sunil, and there was a Western Maryland secession movement for a while where at that time, the 5 counties, including Frederick, were agitating to move into West Virginia. And Alex Mooney, who's from Frederick County and tried to become the congressman, said, well, I can't win in Western Maryland. I'll just move to West Virginia. And now he is a congressman from West Virginia. And let's be fair, Garrett and Allegheny and Washington and maybe certainly Carroll, maybe not Frederick, we can come back to that in a minute, they would feel more comfortable in West Virginia. And we talk about the new secessionist movement, which, in the Civil War era, secession meant states leaving the nation. Now secessionist talk is about counties leaving states and moving to neighboring states. We talk about the Greater Idaho Project, which says Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon, which is mountainous, Walla Walla and so forth. Those towns would like to be part of Idaho rather than be connected with Seattle and Portland, right? And you can see that there's a logic to that, right? There is a certain logic to that. I don't doubt that Garrett Countyans out in Oakland would feel more comfortable being part of West Virginia than they are in Maryland, which is a dominant blue state and multi-ethnic and is driven by the big 7, county exec counties. Study that I teach my students from the Democracy Project, where they show that gerrymandering, the most nefarious effect is 83% of the seats aren't competitive. So people have no reason to turn out for their House member. If they live in a solidly blue or red state, the 2 senators are either Democrats or Republicans. We have the fewest number of split delegation Senate seats in more than a century. We're down to what? Ohio, Montana, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania is now double Democrat with Fetterman. So you don't have a Senate race to vote for. You live in a House district where it's a foregone conclusion. There may be a competitive primary, but the general election, and only 8 or 10 states are competitive in the general election. So in most American states, there's no Senate race, even if there is a contest. There's no House race. There's no presidential race. You're showing up maybe to vote for state and local elections because not a single vote for federal office matters one bit. It's a foregone conclusion. That is a problem for democracy, Sunil. And I think it contributes to the rising polarization because a lot of people feel like my vote doesn't count, whether I'm on the winning side in a blue state and I'm a Democrat, or I'm on a losing side because I live in the outskirts of Cumberland and my voice is not heard in Annapolis or Washington.
And I would say there's a structural and a political answer to this question. The structural stuff is hard, to change the rules. So if you talk to Lee Drutman, the political scientist at the New America Foundation, he would say that what you need is multi-member districts. And so, for instance, if you look at a lot of these places where maybe it's 70-30 Republican, Democrat, well, 30% of people is a lot, but they always lose. And if you had multi-member districts, well, they might get a representative, and that person could then form coalitions with the Republicans there to really get people more of what they need. Now, that's obviously changing the rules is really hard. But one of the things that we argue for is that you need to create a more multiracial coalition, a more multi-ideological coalition. And every once in a while it happens. So for instance, in Texas recently, Governor Greg Abbott has a school voucher plan that he's been pushing really hard. But vouchers don't do anything for people in rural areas, no matter how conservative they are. And you think they might be inclined to something like that. Why? Because in most places, there just are no private schools. So you couldn't use them even if you wanted to. And so the public schools are an absolutely vital anchor for the community. And so he's pushing this through the legislature. And for a change, rural Republicans actually got together with Democratic representatives and they combined to block that plan. And now Abbott is targeting the Republicans who opposed his voucher plan to try to get even more conservative Trumpy Republicans to run against them in primaries to get them out of office. And those people, if he succeeds, they're not going to be supporting what their constituents needs. What we argue at the end of the book is that you need a kind of a new rural movement that isn't focused on just on resentment and just on drawing those lines of identity that say these people are not like us and that's who we hate, that is actually manages to come up with an agenda, which is something they haven't had up until now, an agenda that they can present to both parties and say, are you going to do these things for us or not?
And in all of this is the person you call the unlikely king of rural America.
We heard from people again and again as we were out reporting this book, they would say, well, Donald Trump really speaks our language. And that seems bizarre. He's from Queens. He, lives in Manhattan in a penthouse with golden toilets. And what they mean, though, when he speaks their language, they mean that he speaks the language of anger and hatred, and that when he comes in and talks to them in a way that he swears and he's vulgar and he's hateful and he promotes violence, somebody stands up at a rally with waving a sign and he says, "Kick the shit out of them," and that is something that rural people especially seem to really find so compelling that they had already been feeling resentful, and here comes somebody who doesn't tell them that they ought to tamp that down. He tells them it's something they ought to cultivate. That Trump gave them something kind of emotional and that he could be an expression for all these feelings that they had built up over time, all of these feelings of anger, and that he could be the vehicle for that and he would be a voice for that. And so you see now, for instance, he has said numerous times on the stump, "I will be your retribution."
Why is retributive politics not appealing outside of rural America? Or is the structural situation so bad that it really doesn't matter?
On the first question, I don't know, Sunil. I mean, there are people with, retributional inclinations in cities and suburbs too.
So then explain, why is it that it doesn't play out in those realms, but it plays out in
I think there's the economic sense of grievance as well and the left behind. Your resentments might be cultural and, you might hate the liberals and worry about, critical race theory in the affluent suburbs of Bucks County, Philadelphia, but you're also not like struggling to scrap together to pay your phone bill, perhaps. And so I think it's a little bit different because it's overlaid with this economic panic and genuine desperation.
Yeah, and I would say, just as an addendum to what Tom said, there's some research that showed that the people who were most drawn to Trump in rural areas were not necessarily those who were suffering economically themselves, but who saw their community suffering and felt like there had been a decline in the economic prospects of the place where they lived. And so that really feeds into that in a way that it won't in the suburbs and cities, which are generally more prosperous and are gaining population rather than losing it. Now, when it comes to life after Trump, I think that this is something that nobody really knows. You have somebody like Nikki Haley, who is a very traditional Republican, very conservative, and I have lots of things I don't like about her, but she's a more traditional kind of George H.W. Bush or even George W. Bush kind of Republican, and she gets around 30% of the vote in the primaries. If you add it all up and you look at what the polls were showing, that's about what she was about 30%. That's about the size of the let's move on from Trump part of the Republican Party. And I have not seen any breakouts for the primary campaigns. And it may be that they're just weren't enough competitive ones to really see in rural versus urban areas. Although I did see some analyses for a couple of states that show that, not surprisingly, Trump did particularly well in rural counties versus Haley. So the question is then, that I don't think anyone knows the answer to is, let's say Trump loses this year. And then the party has to come up with some new people, and Haley is probably going to be, at least one of the front runners for next time. And they're going to have to decide, where do we go from here? Parties have to do that every now and again. And, you saw this after 2012, that there was this famous autopsy, quote unquote, that the Republican Party produced, where they did a research project, and the conclusions were, we have to reach out more to immigrants, we have to diversify, and a lot of people in the party believed that. And then Trump came along and said, to hell with that. And it turned out that there was a great appetite in the party for that. And I don't know that people really understood that. I mean, in retrospect, you can see all the different strains that produced him. But the question is then, is there at the national level going to be the faction that wants to get back to some kind of traditional Republican view, or to craft something new? There are forces that want to create kind of a new right-wing populism.
So I don't want to let you go before asking about the personal rage that you have seen as a consequence of your book. Is there any trend in the hate mail that you're getting that is showing you some things, and then how are you dealing with it?
There's a few where people are angry, and as long as they don't curse or call me, faggot or kike or any of these other, I'm sorry to use that language, but this is the exact language, because they assume I'm Jewish because my last name starts SCH. I'm not. Paul is. The crazies I just put in a folder that calls hate mail and voicemails. But I, as a policy, will respond at least once to anybody, even if it's a harsh criticism, as long as they don't go personal. And I find that people break down right immediately. They're like, I didn't think you were going to write back. And they change their tone, and they say, well, now that I have your attention, well, what do you think? And then their tone just changes.
But one of the things that has become clear, especially when it comes to some of our academic critics, is that there are a lot of things that just make them uncomfortable, even when we are citing their own research. I think this is especially true of people who teach in the real politics area and do research in that area. They don't want to say things that sound derogatory toward the people that they study. And so when they do have results that show, for instance, that rural whites are more likely to express certain kinds of racist ideas, for example, they just want to whisper that. They'll say it at an academic conference when there's 15 people in a room, but they don't want to speak it too loudly. On the other hand, when they have results that show that, rural people don't have any different opinions on one topic or another than anybody else, they want to take out the megaphone and shout that to the hilltops. And I understand that, people have different incentives, but we're not going to be downplaying things. We're not going to be using euphemisms. Our book, because it's pitched to a general audience, can be very straightforward. And a lot of the criticism that we've gotten, it's part of the bargain.
Paul Waldman, Tom Schaller, thank you for taking the time. I hope the book does well.
Thanks. I hate politics too, Sunil, but we adore you.
Thank you so much, Sunil. This was a great conversation.
Journalist Paul Waldman and UMBC political science professor Tom Schaller, authors of the book White Rural Rage, The Threat to American Democracy. The only lesson I want to draw this time is to suggest that you read the book. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analysis next week. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, and assistant producers Daniel Galileo, Katarina Gasek, and Catherine Amaya Escobar, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the University's Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from Damascus, Maryland-based rapper and music producer Cataclysm. Songs used in this episode come from his album Machine Gun Preacher. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
My cousin got me hip to that. He might be filled with something, a funny substance called patience, love, and the wisdom will have you on the mission for religion, but don't make you that decision.